Okay, guys, let's start the Ramayana. This is our next big epic that we're going to consider, the great epic of Hinduism, or one of them at least. Okay, so this is just background information. I covered this in the very first lecture that was optional, so I'll just briefly go over it now. The majority of the texts from ancient India that we are interested in take place during the what's called the heroic age of India. The earliest writings are the Vedas. I had you read like a little bit of one of these for one of the origin stories um, lecture. The Upanishads, the Ramayana, this is the epic that we are reading, or at least we're reading it in excerpts. This is the first epic that was composed, but there are others. In fact, the next is the other very famous one is called the Mahabharata, a little bit later in composition. Kind of at the same time as these things going on, stories from the Jataka were originating. The Jataka stories, some of them are primarily Hindu, but some of them start to take on Buddhist ideas. The Bhagavad Gita, as some of you might have heard of, it's an aspect of the Mahabharata, but it's a little bit later. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. And then the Tamil anthologies, which we covered last time. So the majority of these take place or like not take place, but they were written towards the northern part of India. So a little bit more potentially interactions between Greece on this side, on the western side, and then China on the eastern side. What else to say? Oh, one other thing to keep in mind with writing in India is that it's a very blurry line between oral and written literature. So, as these things were being composed, it's kind of unclear whether they were being written down literally or if they were just reiterated so much that they were memorized. Because these religions, they do a lot of chanting and that sort of thing. The top, most of these up to the Bhagavad Gita, were originally composed in Sanskrit, and then Tamil anthologies were in Tamil, a different language system from the south. Okay, I think that's an okay introduction. You might know much more about these traditions than I do, which is great. Please bring that insight to our class, because these texts are more new to me than the others from the Western traditions. Okay, so some background about the Ramayana is that it was originally composed in Sanskrit, and the myth behind it is that it was written by this poet Valmiki. This is unclear. He might be a figure like Homer or perhaps Confucius. That maybe he literally existed, but perhaps there's some mythological aspects of his character too. He's probably real, but anyway, the myth is that he wrote this thing in a fit of inspiration. This is where I think it's a little mythological because the poem is really really long, so it's around 24,000 verses. It's one of the longest epics in the whole of the ancient world. Dating the poem is very difficult, like I said, with the oral and written divide in ancient Indian writing or literature. The oldest parts seem to be from around the 7th to 4th century BC. The newest are 3rd century BCE, so it was being written down and perfected over the centuries, much like Homer's works and Confucius's works as well. In the Hindu tradition, the Ramayana is considered the first poem, before the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita, of course. So this is the first epic poem. This is why I focused on this one. There's going to be other reasons, as you'll see when we talk about the Ramayana. Many versions of the epic exist in Indian languages. So there are many languages in not just ancient India, but India now, like very many language traditions. There are different translations of the Ramayana into different languages. There's different versions of the story that emphasize different parts. It's a very interesting epic in that light. There's not really a standard edition like there would become a standard edition of Homer's Odyssey, for example. It's kind of more in line a little bit with like the Epic of Gilgamesh. We read the standard edition of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but that that epic exists in different forms and different story points in different language traditions as well. And the Ramayana is like that, but like even more so. There's so many different versions of this epic. There's versions that emphasize different religious aspects. So the Ramayana primarily is a Hindu epic. We'll talk a little bit about Hinduism in just a second, but there are Jain versions and also Buddhist versions of the Ramayana, Sikh versions, that will emphasize the sort of philosophical and religious traditions of those groups. So it's a very adaptable epic as well. It's very different than Homer's epics in that way. We are reading, in our class, we're reading a translation of the Ramayana that has been very, very heavily excerpted. And we're reading it, it's a translation into English, and it's a translation of a Tamil version of the epic from the 11th century by this poet named Kamban. So Valmiki wrote it in Sanskrit in 7 to 4 BC apparently, and later, much later, in sort of like what we would call the medieval period in the West, the 11th century AD, this poet Kamban reads the Sanskrit, translates it into Tamil, and then we have a poet in the later 20th century reading it in Tamil and translating it into English. So we are very far removed in a way from the Sanskrit original, but still aspects of the original come through, of course. So it's still worth reading, obviously, in translation. But just so you know, we have this kind of distance from the original. Okay, things to emphasize. It is a Hindu epic. That's kind of my approach to the Ramayana. So you will note similarities to the Odyssey. There's a lot in common between the two epics, but this one is different in ways that I think are associated with the religion of the composition. So so some of the similarities to the Odyssey, we have like a young hero who goes on a journey of maturation. So like Telemachus goes on a journey to grow up in a way and learn about the man he should be. He's led by a mentor. Very same kind of storyline takes place in the Ramayana. We also have in the Ramayana a hero encountering different monsters or scenarios that test him. And we have like an archery contest, which is very specific, that leads to a marriage of the hero and heroine. So much like in the Odyssey, it's not really the marriage of the hero and heroine, but like the remarriage. They like renew their vows or something like that. But in this epic, in the Ramayana, there's an archery contest that transforms into a marriage. And then we have these interesting moments where the hero and heroine test each other's fidelity. And I'm being kind of purposely vague there because it takes a very different form in the Ramayana than it did in the Odyssey. So my guiding question in approaching this epic, in contrast to the Odyssey, is what makes this epic, what makes the Ramayana distinct as an epic? Like, what makes it different? How does Hinduism affect the values and form of an epic tale? And I think we'll be able to answer this question with more specifics in a second, and also just throughout the days that we spend on this epic. Okay, so first let's talk briefly about Hinduism, because I think that this is going to kind of dictate the ways in which this epic is different than the epics we've read so far. So my discussion of Hinduism here comes from Maya Warrior. This is a brief guide. I can share it with you online if you want to read the whole thing. But Faith Guides for Higher Education, a guide to Hinduism. This is a very rudimentary guide. It tries its best to be as generic as possible. So you might have greater expertise and insights into this tradition of Hinduism than Maya Warrior's guide will give us. But she's going for breadth, and it's kind of very difficult to articulate central aspects of Hinduism because it is so varied of a religion, depending on where you are and how you practice it, and etc., the language you speak. But one of the really important components of Hinduism is this idea that they term samsara. And samsara is basically understood as like a cycle. So here's I've got a circle. It's kind of trying to be evocative of samsara. But what samsara is this idea of like oneness and cyclical nature. So beings are reincarnated into the world over and over again in a cycle called samsara. So think of a circle when you're thinking of Hinduism. life is not finite, like it doesn't have a beginning and an end. Rather, souls are reborn into new bodies in a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth without beginning or end. This is, in shorthand, we might call this like reincarnation, the transmigration of souls. This idea that life doesn't end with your material death at the end of this life. It's the beginning of a new cycle, potentially, of rebirth into a new form. So that's very different from anything we've read so far, I think. Maybe some of the aspects of ancient China might resonate a little bit more with this. There's a component of samsara to Buddhism that will become popular in the East later. But, just think of how this kind of changes the game. In our epic so far, we've been thinking about heroes grappling with their mortality and how they want to live their lives. But that was under the assumption that their life was finite, that they wouldn't be reborn, they wouldn't transform. So this is quite different. The hero can, reincarnate in another form, or the heroine, for example, could. So very interesting, right? Okay, so that seems minor and unimportant, but actually this tiny shift changes everything. Okay, so a little bit more about Hinduism. So this is just repeating the samsara thing just because it's so important. So this cyclical nature of life. So meanwhile, while samsara is happening, where all souls are being reborn and in a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, karma is important. So one individual, their actions in the world is called karma. So one's actions in this life determine the course of events in future lives. So while you're going on this cyclical journey, what you do in this life can affect your future lives. Good actions lead to happiness in a subsequent life, and bad actions lead to suffering. However, samsara refers to a world marked mostly by suffering, so the ultimate goal should be not merely achieving happiness in future incarnations, but instead securing release from the samsaric cycle altogether. So it's not like you're trying to level up so you get the best possible life ever. Like you want to be like a Kardashian and then your next life or something. That's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to transcend samsara altogether. Release from samsaric cycle. This release is called moksha and can be achieved by striving for inner discipline, detaching from the affairs of the world, and seeking spiritual enlightenment. Moksha is one word for it. You might have heard the word nirvana. This idea of transcendence, but specifically it's transcendence from samsara, the cyclical nature of life. Okay, so hopefully, you probably have heard of the word karma. Of course, bring questions if you have them for our synchronous classes or in your discussion post. One other thing to kind of keep in mind, Brahman, this term refers to the essence and unity of the universe thought to underlie all apparent diversity. So this idea of oneness might be similar to the Tao in ancient China. So in contrast to Brahman, we have Atman. Atman is the essence of the individual self, which leads a fragmentary existence since it is caught in the samsaric cycle. So as you're kind of caught in samsara, your particular individual life cycle is Atman, and all the while you're trying to achieve moksha by realizing Brahman, if that makes sense. So you want to realize that everything is actually connected, and even when things seem really diverse, everything is one. It's united in the universe. And so anyway, everyone in your Atman cycle or whatever is trying to achieve this awareness of unity so that you can better kind of be released from samsara. This is sort of how I understand it, at least. I might be phrasing this not as sophisticated as I should be, and so apologies if that's the case, but I was not raised in this tradition, probably, obviously. So in most popular Hindu philosophical traditions, Brahman and Atman are seen as intrinsically one. Atman exists when one fails to realize this oneness and thus remains trapped in samsara. So when you're feeling your most human, hungry, petty, jealous, horny, whatever, that might mean you're caught in Atman and you're not realizing that actually everything is connected, everything is Brahman. Okay, so hopefully that was useful. I'll be using these terms as we continue forward as we talk about the Ramayana. But yeah, this religious tradition really undergirds a lot of what's going on in the Ramayana. So some other things just to kind of note. This is also a very brief introduction. There are many, many deities or gods in the Hindu tradition. So I'm not going to cover all of them, obviously, but in terms of the Ramayana, the focus, the most important god is Krishna. Wait, no, sorry, not Krishna. Vishnu. Vishnu is the guardian of the world order and was thought to incarnate himself in human or animal form every time chaos threatened to upset the balance of the world. Two significant incarnations of Vishnu include Rama and Krishna. So Vishnu is the god that we're mostly concerned with in this epic, and we're concerned with a particular iteration of this god named Rama. That's where, his name is Rama. The epic is called the Ramayana, the story of Rama. So Rama is actually the incarnation of a god in a human form. So to use some of the language from the last slide, everything is Brahman, like we're all connected, etc. But Rama is kind of caught in the situation of, his like Atman or whatever as he's going about the world, and his kind of task is to realize the innate oneness of the universe. Okay, all right, so this will get more easier to understand as we kind of come up with examples. But one cool thing about Hinduism is they really like numbers. Here are the three really important gods in Hinduism, and they each have a girlfriend. So there's three really important goddesses. So like, I bring these up just because I think they're really interesting. They have this creator god, Brahma. I think it's this one. Brahma is the creator god, so he creates things out of nothing. They have this god Shiva, the destroyer. So Shiva destroys the creations that Brahma creates. And then Vishnu is really important. This is the reason why we have so many stories about Vishnu and his incarnations, because he is the guy who achieves balance between creation and destruction. So he's like, in some ways, he's kind of like the symbol of justice, between innate oneness with the universe or innate injustice or something. He's the one who kind of like balances creation, destruction. If you picture the image of a balance, like scales of justice, that can help you visualize like his role. So while the universe is being created and destroyed over and over and over again, Vishnu steps in the form of his incarnations to kind of like restore order. So he's the guardian of the world's order, and he's thought to incarnate himself in human form or animal form every time chaos threatened to upset the balance of the world. So just note how often like balance and order are emphasized. Vishnu's he's about justice. He's trying to restore order. Okay, he's got a wife, Lakshmi. She's the goddess of wealth, beauty, luck. Also, in some traditions, she's literally Mother Earth. So I'm not going to say too much more about her here, but these seem kind of distinct aspects of her, wealth and beauty and luck. Those seem like maybe superficial things, potentially. But Mother Earth, we're going to see this kind of distinction again with Lakshmi and her form, her incarnate form as Sita. And Shiva's bride is Parvati, Brahma's bride is Saraswati. Okay, I'm going to stop there. There's many, many more stories to be told here, but we should focus on the Ramayana because that's what you guys read for class. Okay, so this comes from the introduction that of the edition I assigned. Vishnu, the god, says this moment at some point. Basically, I'm including this because the Ramayana kind of starts with the assumption that we already know this story. And so if you don't know the story, this will be really confusing. But so I'm trying to kind of introduce the story here. So Vishnu in the intro says, the poet is quoting Vishnu. So there's this character named Ravana. Ravana can be destroyed only by a human being since he never asked for protection from a human being. Vishnu decides to incarnate as Dasaratha's son, and my conch and wheel, which I hold in each hand for certain purposes, and my couch, namely Adisesha, the serpent, on whose coils I rest, shall be as my brothers, and all the gods here shall take birth in the world below as a monkey clan, since Ravana has been cursed in earlier times to expect his destruction only from a monkey. Okay, so this is probably going to seem very confusing if you don't know this story, but basically the Ramayana is about Vishnu incarnated as a human named Rama, who is put on the earth to destroy Ravana, who is this like demon creature who is causing chaos in the world. And so Vishnu decides to incarnate as the son of a king. All of his iconography will also incarnate as his brothers, and all the gods he's hanging out with in the universe will also incarnate as a monkey clan. So there's going to be a monkey clan going on, helping Rama in his journey. And it's all due to this prophecy that like Ravana, this demon, has been cursed to expect his destruction from a monkey. Okay, and apparently Ravana, he's got a particular evil that can only be destroyed by a human. So this is kind of interesting that this god has to incarnate as a human to destroy a demon. Okay, so let's get some visual stuff here. So Vishnu, so this god of order, he is often depicted this way. He's blue. I'm not exactly sure why his skin is blue, but he's blue. He has 4 arms, and he's got like particular iconography that he's always holding. He's got like a lotus, some kind of staff thing. He's got a wheel and a conch shell. I'm sure these things have a lot of meaning, but I don't know it all myself. Usually he's also depicted he's reclining on a serpent, but I don't have that image here, but we'll see it later. Maybe not today, but so we've got Vishnu. He's the god. He needs to destroy Ravana, this demon dude. Ravana is really cool looking. He's got 10 heads. He's got 10 heads, and he can play the sitar with his intestines. So he's kind of this amazing, miraculous demon guy. What's really interesting about Ravana too is he's like our antagonist. He's our bad guy, but actually Ravana is very wise, and he's a sage in the tradition of Hinduism. Like he studied Hinduism so much. And that's why he's so powerful, but he's kind of like turned towards like destruction and chaos, and Vishnu is called upon to kind of set order again. And Vishnu has to set order through incarnation as a human. And so this is our main character of the Ramayana, Rama. So Rama looks a lot like Vishnu, but he's only got 2 arms. Anyway, part of Rama's journey will be kind of like realizing that he's the incarnation of a god. Okay, so that's kind of our basic storyline. Good guy, bad guy. All right. Okay, so another thing to notice about the Ramayana as you read, it's filled with exemplars. So this is the same word as the 24 exemplars in the Chinese tradition. Exemplars are models for behavior. So the Ramayana conveys all these ideals for Hindus, like how to organize and conduct the ideal state or kingdom, how to have the ideal ruler, Dasarata, or subsequent rulers. I don't want to spoil it. How to be the ideal servant. That's like the monkey servant guy who helps Rama. The best father, the best son, the best husband, the best wife. I have a question mark here because this is going to be kind of an issue in the story. But yeah, unlike the Odyssey or the Iliad, we're not exactly, so unlike those epics, this epic really wants us to have a good role model. It's like, like Christianity, where like the main character Christ the main character of the New Testament is Christ. We're meant to kind of emulate his behavior. In the Quran as well, there's sort of like models for behavior. That really wasn't the case with the Odyssey and the Iliad. We're not really meant to act like Achilles. But yeah, we're meant to act like Rama, I think. Okay. All right, so as his journey begins, there's 2 aspects of his initial journey. This is in the first readings that I assigned. First, he becomes educated. So the chapters are called Rama's initiation. So this occurs while traveling with his mentor named Sage Viswamitra. And then it's also important that he is initiated through marriage. So this is kind of interesting to my mind. because in a way, it's a bit like Rama is kind of a combination of Telemachus and Odysseus. So Telemachus, who is initiated by becoming educated by a wise male figure, and then Odysseus is already married. So it's a bit like Rama is combining the two storylines, and with this added like complication, which is the fact that Rama is the incarnation of a god. So he's like needing to learn at the same time as he, in some ways, already knows everything, because he's a god. But this is kind of back to the cycle between Atman and Brahman a little bit, or the trick of getting out of samsara. Okay, so that's what I'll be talking about today, his sort of initial journeys. Okay, so in his initiation, keep in mind it's an educational journey. So it's much like Telemachus' educational journey. We have this moment, page 9 here. Sage Viswamitra goes to Dasarata the king and asks to mentor Rama. And this is one of the reasons why he gives that Rama needs mentoring. He says, a seed that sprouts at the foot of its parent tree remains stunted until it is transplanted. Rama will be in my care and he will be quite well, but ultimately he will leave me too. Every human being, when the time comes, has to depart and seek his fulfillment his own way. So I include this just because it is a very common way of looking at education. A seed that sprouts at the foot of its parent tree remains stunted until it is transplanted. There is an aspect of education that needs transplantation in order for it to thrive. And this is a transplantation that will continue to happen as you age and mature and become more and more educated in your life. You'll have mentors who will care for you, but eventually you'll leave them too. As you guys went from, primary school to secondary school, and now you're in college, maybe you'll go on, to learn new things in different ways, but it's always going to be this kind of series of transplantations. And you might ask yourself why that is. In the metaphor, this is true of seeds of trees. Like if there's a seed that sprouts at the foot of the parent tree, it's not going to grow as much as that parent tree is because it doesn't have the same amount of sunlight that it's getting. The parent is overshadowing it, literally. It will stifle its growth. And so this is a very literal metaphor in a way. You remove seedlings from the parent tree and then like cultivate them elsewhere. This is true probably of you guys too. I mean, you can tell your parents this, you're like, I'm quoting Sage Viswamitra, I need to be transplanted from the foot of my parent tree, in order to learn. You're not going to learn as much if you've got parents, shadowing you all the time. Okay, good to know. You might ask yourself why. Maybe. Okay, and then one moment I include just because it reminds me so much of the Odyssey. Rama and Lakshmana depart. So Sage Viswamitra is going to be the teacher. Rama decides to go with his favorite brother, Lakshmana. And the two of them go with the sage, following the footsteps of their master like his shadows. So kind of similar language of shadowing that I was using before. But following the footsteps of their master, compare Homer, Telemachus followed in the footsteps of the goddess. This is when he's following Athena dressed as Mentes in book 1. So yeah, if you have a good teacher, following in their footsteps makes some sense as you kind of learn what you value in this world. But eventually you'll outstrip them too and go towards your own path. Okay? So here are some aspects of Rama's initiation. I'm not going to cover everything, but here's some interesting moments that might kind of remind you of other things we've read. So he's learning the origin of the world and how the world works through stories told about the natural world. So one of the stories he learns is Ganga's story. This is an image, like a personification of Ganga here. The goddess Ganga from the Gupta period. Ganga is in some ways she's a goddess, but also she's the personification of the Ganges River. So the river is this like buxom, beautiful, like super voluptuous female. Ooh. Okay, so Ganga story. There you see the river Ganga, the holiest river in the world, starting from the Himalayas, running her course through the mountains and valleys and across several kingdoms. Today she flows along peacefully, but at the beginning, now listen to her story. she had to be kind of tamed into being peaceful, which is interesting. Something potentially to write about. He learns about Thataka's story. So Rama comes onto this like desert landscape and he goes, why is the land so terrible? Why does it seem accursed? And he learns Thataka's story, which is like this horrible story of this feminized monster who, for various reasons, like turns the land into a desert. So it's unhospitable or inhospitable for life. So I'm not going into details on either of those stories, but you can look at them yourselves. But this is sort of like the overall lesson that Sage Visvamitra is trying to impart on Rama and Lakshmana. That is, every inch of the ground on Earth has a divine association. Mother Earth has been there since the beginning of creation, being one of the 5 primeval elements. She has seen countless pairs of feet running about on thousands of aims and pursuits, both evil and good, and will continue until time, or Kala, swallows and digests everything. Even after the participants have vanished, every inch of Earth still retains the impress of all that has gone before. We attain a full understanding only when we are aware of the divine and other associations of every piece of ground we tread on. Otherwise, it would be like the passage of a blind man through illuminated halls and gardens. So note how this resonates with our discussion of Hinduism before, the sort of like need to realize Brahman, the innate unity of everything. And in these lines, the innate unity of everything kind of correlates to the innate divinity of everything. There's a divine association to everything on the earth. And humans attain full understanding when they're aware of these associations with everything that they encounter. Okay, interesting. There's a plug for Mother Earth here. This might be kind of like a hint at Lakshmi, Vishnu's wife, the goddess of the earth. Okay, Rama's initiation. Okay, so here's a little bit more about Thataka's story, just because it shows what Rama will start to do in the story. So Thataka, she's like the evil female monster. She comes upon them. She's also the personification of this desert land. She loomed over them, with her eyes spitting fire, her fangs bared, her lips parted, revealing a cavernous mouth, and her brows twitching in rage. She raised her trident and roared, "In this my kingdom I have crushed out the minutest womb of life, and you have been sent down so that I may not remain hungry." She's threatening to eat them. And note that she's crushing out every bit of life. So she's a desert. She's inhospitable to life. Rama hesitates. For all her evil, she was still a woman. How could he kill her? So Rama is being threatened with being eaten, and he hesitates because he doesn't want to kill a woman. Reading his thoughts, Visvamitra, his mentor, says, "You shall not consider her a woman at all. Such a monster should receive no consideration. Her strength, ruthlessness, appearance rule her out of that category. A woman of demoniac tendencies loses all consideration to be treated as a woman. This monster, at the very scent of living creature, craves to eat and kill. Do not picture her as a woman at all. You must rid this world of her. It is your duty." So this is quite interesting. I mean, it is his duty to rid the world of demons. When Rama, the incarnation of Vishnu, comes into the world, that's his job. He's like a demon hunter. In fact, he's going after Ravana, the kind of like most powerful demon. But it's interesting how much emphasis they put on her gender. So I put this in here just because so much in this epic is about gender, and I wanted to kind of plant that seed here. So Visvamitra says, don't think of her as a woman. She's out of that category because of her behavior. Okay, interesting. So keep that in mind. Okay, finally, Rama, so he's roused by these words. Finally, Rama's arrow pierced her throat and ended her career, thereby also inaugurating Rama's life mission of destroying evil and demonry in the world. Great. So he kills this. This is his first kill, Thataka, this female monster. So also note, of course, the similarities between this story and the Odyssey. There's like female monsters that feature a lot in the Odyssey as well. Okay, maybe in different forms, but yeah. Okay, I really want to talk about this story because it's so interesting. Ahalya. This one's very interesting. Okay. And it's very important too. This is the last story we hear before Rama gets married. So I think it's really important, in terms of its play with gender and what it's stating about justice and gender in light of Rama and his behavior. Okay, so here's the story. While passing over slightly raised ground beside the walls of the fort of Mithila city, this is where Sita lives. So just before they enter the city, Rama notices a shapeless slab of stone, half buried vertically in the ground. When he brushed past, the dust of his feet fell on it and transformed it that very instant into a beautiful woman. So we've got a stone turning into a woman. As the woman did obeisance and stood aside respectfully, Vishwamitra introduced her to Rama. Obeisance is that's where we get the term obey. So she's made herself submissive. She's kind of sort of worshiping, but prostrating herself before him, as a submissive person, and stood aside respectfully. So Vishwamitra introduces her to Rama. If you have heard of sage Gautama, whose curse resulted in great Indra's body being studded with 1,000 eyes all over, this lady was his wife. Her name is Ahalya. So we're going to hear the story of Ahalya. She was married, or is married, to sage Gautama, and something to do with their marriage becomes the reason why Indra, who is a god, is cursed with his body being studded with 1,000 eyes all over. Okay, so we'll say a little bit more about this. Okay, so here's the story. So Brahma, this is the creator god, to remind you. Brahma once created out of the ingredients of absolute beauty a woman, and she was called Ahalya, which in the Sanskrit language means non-imperfection. This might remind you of some of the origin stories we read where a woman is created by a god for a particular reason. And specifically also she's quite beautiful, apparently. She's made out of absolute beauty. Okay, so Brahma creates Ahalya. God Indra, being the highest god among the gods, was attracted by her beauty and was convinced that he alone was worthy of claiming her hand. Brahma, noticing the conceit and presumptuousness of Indra, ignored him, sought out sage Gautama, and left him in charge of the girl. She grew up in his custody, and when the time came, the sage took her back to Brahma and handed her over to him. Okay, so I'm going to talk about these lines in a second, but just to note our characters, we've got Brahma creating this haughty woman named Ahalya. The god Indra sees her, is immediately attracted by her, and wants to marry her. Brahma doesn't want to give his creation to Indra, and instead gives Ahalya to sage Gautama to raise as a daughter, presumably. This is kind of interesting, right? How old is this girl? Kind of one of the questions. So Ahalya grew up in sage Gautama's custody. When the time came, he took her back to Brahma and handed her over to him. So this is kind of a lot said here with this phrase, when the time came. What do you think that means? How does he know when the time came to take her back to Brahma? I assume it means, maybe she's a woman now. I'm putting that in quotes. Maybe she's got her period or something. Maybe she's, gone through puberty, whatever it is. And she's now a woman or something. But anyway, there's a time that comes when sage Gautama does not want to be in charge of her anymore. It's interesting, given what happens later. Brahma appreciated Gautama's purity of mind and heart. Never once had any carnal thought crossed his mind. Carnal thoughts are thoughts of the body, of the physical body. So we're talking about sexuality here. So Brahma appreciated Gautama's purity of mind and said, "Marry her, she is fit to be your wife, or rather you alone deserve to be her husband." Accordingly, she was married, blessed by Brahma and the other gods. Having spent her childhood with Gautama, Ahalya knew his needs, so proved a perfect wife, and they lived happily. So you might have some thoughts here as well, but just a couple things to note. Brahma gives this girl, this beautiful, most beautiful woman, his creation. He gives her to Gautama because he is pure. If someone is pure, why does that mean he needs a beautiful woman? I don't understand exactly the gift there, but apparently this is a good thing. I think the story is inviting us to think that a pure-hearted man deserves a very, very beautiful woman. Okay. Interesting. Also note, this might make you a little bit uncomfortable, but the idea that Ahalya is a really great wife for Gautama because he raised her is interesting. So she's kind of transforming from this daughter role into a wife role with the same, the father figure becomes the husband kind of thing. So anyway, interesting story. Okay, let's keep going. So that's what's going on. So they're married now. Gautama and Ahalya are married. But something's going to happen with Indra. So here's an image of Indra. This image is, it kind of presents Indra and Ahalya as consensually engaged with one another sexually. You can kind of see that they seem to like each other. But the story seems to belie what this image is suggesting. Okay, so Indra, however, never got over his infatuation for Ahalya and often came in different guises near to Gautama's ashram, waiting for every chance to gaze and feast on Ahalya's form and figure. So an ashram is like your meditation studio. When you're a Hindu, when you're trying to achieve samsara, you go to your ashram to like focus on the important things. Okay, so Indra, he's focused on Ahalya. He's really interested in her. He wants to gaze and feast on her form and figure. So this is kind of interesting language. Feasting, that's eating. How can he eat her form and figure? He's looking so intently that it's like he's consuming her. Unable to bear the pangs of love anymore, Indra decided to attain the woman of his heart by subterfuge. Subterfuge is like trickery. One day, hardly able to wait for the sage to leave at his usual hour, Indra assumed the voice of a rooster and woke up the sage, who, thinking that the morning had come, left for the river. Now Indra assumed the sage's form, entered the hut, and made love to Ahalya. She surrendered herself, but at some stage realized that the man enjoying her was an impostor, but she could do nothing about it. Okay, so this is a really interesting story that kind of like puts Ahalya's behavior, it makes it ambiguous. Like, does she want to have sex with this man that is not her husband, or is she raped here? I mean, this is, there's big stakes to how you would interpret this. Indra is a shape-shifting god, so he transforms into a rooster to wake up Gautama, and then he transforms into Gautama himself to go have sex with Ahalya. If we were going to be very, very critical of Ahalya, perhaps we might say, Ahalya, do you think your husband, who is so pious and a sage, do you think he would go to the ashram and then come back immediately to have sex with you? That doesn't really seem like his style. He's pretty pure-minded. But on the other hand, I have a lot of compassion for Ahalya. She's a young woman. She's probably interested in having sex with her husband. Most, wives like that. I mean, potentially, asexuality exists, but, I would assume Ahalya wants to have sex with her husband. So maybe she's excited. She's like, oh, he's come back because he actually wants me, and so she has sex with him. But then at some point realizes this is not really her husband. And so she's like, I'm being, at some point she could be realizing she's being raped, which is a pretty horrible situation. Okay, the story continues. Indra then turns himself into a cat, the most facile animal formed for sneaking in and out, and tried to slip away. But the sage arrested the cat where he was with these words, "Cat, I know you." So sage Gautama catches the two having sex. Indra transforms into a cat, and then the sage yells at the cat, "Cat, I know you. Your obsession with the female is your undoing. May your body be covered with 1,000 female marks so that in all the worlds people may understand what really goes on in your mind all the time." Hardly had these words left his lips when every inch of Indra's body displayed the female organ. There could be no greater shame for the proud and self-preening Indra. So Indra, the shape-shifting god, he's cursed by Gautama for having sex with his wife or raping his wife, depending on how you interpret it. He's cursed by being covered with female genitalia, basically. Like instead of eyes here, you would imagine like vaginas, vulvas. And apparently this is like a horrible shame. There's no greater shame for the proud, self-preening Indra, but the punishment matches the crime to sage Gautama, because if Indra is feasting on her form all the time, if he's so obsessed with having sex with her, Now, being covered with the female organ, everyone will understand what goes on in his mind. So it's kind of this way where the outside matches his inside virtue. Brahma, the creator god, convinces the sage to alter the punishment. He says, "May the 1,000 additions to Indra's features become eyes." So Brahma's like, that's actually inappropriate to be covered so much with female organs. In my mind, I think it's fine. I think he should be covered with female organs. There's nothing wrong with female organs to my mind, but whatever. Brahma says, no, let's turn those into eyes. Indra thereafter came to be known as the 1,000-eyed god. So this is the sort of form that we know Indra as, covered with 1,000 eyes. To my mind, this doesn't seem like a punishment for his crime. He wanted to feast on her form and figure. Now he can do it from every aspect of his body. He can look at her. This doesn't seem like a punishment to me, but I am not Brahma. Okay, I wonder what you guys think of this. The story continues. So here kind of captures the next part of the story. Ahalya, remember we meet her, she's turned into stone. So Ahalya gets punished too. So the sage punishes Indra, arguably, and Ahalya is punished. After Indra slunk away back to his world, Gautama looked at his wife and said, "You have sinned with your body. May that body harden into a shapeless piece of granite, just where you are." Now in desperation, Ahalya implored, "A grave mistake has been committed. It is the nature of noble souls to forgive the errors of lesser beings. Please, I am already feeling a weight creeping up my feet. Do something. Please help me." So this is, it ignites my compassion. She says, "Please, I didn't know, like I'm a lesser being than you. Have compassion. Do something to help me. I'm turning into stone." The sage felt sorry for her and said, "Your redemption will come when the son of Dasarata, Rama, passes this way at some future date." When? Where? She essayed to question desperately, but before the words could leave her lips, she had become a piece of stone. So Ahalya is transformed into stone as punishment. And so you might ask yourself, like, how does this punishment fit her crime? If Indra is punished by being covered with a female organ so that his outside matches his inside, how does turning Ahalya into stone make her outside match her inside? He says, "You have sinned with your body. May that body harden into a shapeless piece of granite, just where you are." It's kind of interesting. So his logic is, you have made your body an instrument of sin, so now I'm going to force your body to harden into a shapeless piece of granite. I'm going to punish your body for being attractive by making it stone, like completely innate, not innate, but inert, like, powerlessness. To my mind, however, I think his punishment reveals not her being stony, being kind of hard and inert, but his punishment kind of reveals that Gautama himself is hard-hearted and inert. Sometimes, this is my interpretation, of course. I think others might disagree with me. Often in ancient stories, sexualized women are punished for their sexuality. This is kind of standard. It still happens today. To my mind, however, I think that this is a bit of a it demonstrates the lack of compassion that Gautama has for his wife. She may have been raped here, and he still punishes her. I find this hard to take, but let me know what your thoughts are on this story. In what ways are Gautama's punishments justified? Okay, so and so this is the story, and the son of Dasarata will pass this way at a future date, and he'll save her, and that is what happens. Rama does come by, his feet brush the stone, and Ahalya is transformed back into a human, and she can go back to her husband now. I sort of wonder what the moral of this story is, however. Certainly something's going on with a hard-hearted husband who punishes his wife for something that may be outside of her control. This is a hint of things to come with Rama's own story. And so, Ahalya's story is the last step before Rama gets married. here, so I'm just kind of making it very clear. Ahalya's story is in some way associated with Rama's marriage to Sita. Ahalya turned a stone right outside of Matila city, which is where Sita is from. So keep this story in mind. It foreshadows marital issues. Okay. One thing that's interesting about Matila is it is like a place that is perfect. I always distrust perfection, especially in stories, because it usually masks something very wrong. So Matila, after all the forests, mountain paths, valleys, and places of solitude and silence through which we have traveled thus far, offers a pleasant change to a city of color and pleasure, with people enjoying the business of living. The very minute Rama steps into Matila, he notices golden turrets and domes and towers and colorful flags fluttering in the wind as if to welcome a royal bridegroom-to-be. There was no charity in Kosala country, since there was no one to receive it. So this is remarkable. This is a place where there is no suffering, and they don't need charity, because no one is suffering. Amazing. I don't trust it. I might be suspicious of a place like this. What's cool is in Rama seeing Sita, we have kind of like this moment of love at first sight. So the people, sage Viswamitra, Rama, and Lakshmana, they cross the moat surrounding Janaka's palace. Janaka is the king of Matila, so he's the father of Sita. So they cross the moat with its golden spires soaring above the other buildings of the city. Now Rama observed on a balcony Princess Sita playing with her companions. He stood arrested by her beauty, and she noticed him at the same moment. Their eyes met. They had been together not so long ago in Vaikuntha, their original home in heaven, as Vishnu and his spouse Lakshmi, but in their present incarnation, suffering all the limitations of mortals, they looked at each other as strangers. So this moment of love at first sight, it's not just love at first sight, it's like they're soulmates, because actually Sita and Rama are incarnations of Lakshmi and Vishnu, these eternal, divine, married couple. Amazing. Maybe this is how you view marriage. You know, maybe you see your soulmate or something like that and you marry them. Wonderful. I hope that's true. I don't know. Okay, another connection to the Odyssey here. The king has this young lady that I think she's his adopted daughter, Sita. He doesn't know what to do with her. She's so beautiful, like everyone wants to marry her, and he's having trouble picking like a good husband for her because everyone wants her. And so he's like, oh, what do I do? So he makes this contest. He had in his possession an enormous bow, which at one time belonged to Shiva. Shiva is the destroyer god. Unable to favor anyone in particular to give Sita in marriage, and in order to ward them off, King Janaka made it a condition that whoever could lift, bend, and string Shiva's bow would be considered fit to be Sita's husband. So he's like, I can't choose. Whoever can string this bow can marry Sita. The bow is enormous. It was placed in a carriage on 8 pairs of wheels and drawn by a number of men. So it's like this enormous bow. So this is very similar to the Odyssey, where like this bow was like amazing. It's very difficult to string. This is kind of like more than amazing. It's like impossible. So what spectators missed because they shut their eyes was to note how swiftly Rama picked up the bow, tugged the string taut, and brought the tips together. So he's able to string the bow, just like Odysseus. They were startled when they heard a deafening report caused by the cracking of the bow at its arch, which could not stand the pressure of Rama's grip. So unlike Odysseus, who can string the bow and then just like he mimics the contest, he, shoots the arrow through all the axe heads, Rama breaks the bow. So this is pretty impressive. It's this bow that no one can even pick up, but Rama not only picks it up, he breaks it. This is also potentially like a claim that Rama is more important than Shiva, or like Vishnu is more powerful than Shiva. In Hinduism, different sects like different gods, or they celebrate a particular god more than another. So anyway, there's a sect that really likes Vishnu, and they love the Ramayana, of course, because of that. Okay, so he breaks the bow. This seems kind of emasculating to other men, and he gets married. I'm including these last few slides because I think that they also foreshadow trouble to come in the marriage between Sita and Rama. So here's the scene. So Rama and Sita are going to get married. They're so excited. Sita hopes that the guy who strung the bow is the same guy she saw, that she fell in love with, because it's actually her husband from heaven. Okay, so our poet has this moment where he translates what Valmiki is saying in the original. Anyway, here it is. Okay, so the poet is especially happy and detailed when describing the mood and the activity of the young in this festive crowd. A youth followed a carriage at a trot, his eyes fixed on the window at which a face had appeared a little while ago, hoping for another glimpse of that face. Another young man could not take his eye off the lightly covered breast of a girl in a chariot. When a girl inadvertently slipped down the back of a horse, another young man picked her up, but instead of setting her down after the rescue, he journeyed on with her in his arms. Another went along, brooding and reflecting as he gazed on his beloved. Couples who had a quarrel over some detail of the arrangements for this journey walked side by side without speaking, the woman not caring to wear a flower in her hair, but only a frown on her face, yet close enough to each other to avoid separation. So, even though everyone is really, really happy because Rama and Sita have gotten married, there are clues that things are not all what they seem. It's not all just happy. We've got these young men who are being rather creepy. Maybe stalking some girl at a window, potentially. Maybe stalking's too critical of a word, but he certainly is trying to look at this woman, which may or may not be bad. But another young man, he's staring at the breast of a girl in a chariot. This one is particularly troubling to me. This girl slips down a horse and this young man helps her, but then instead of helping her back where she was, he kind of kidnaps her a little bit. He journeyed on with her in his arms. It's unclear whether she wants to be in his arms, And then we have this married couple who are not talking to one another. This is, all sorts of clues that maybe marriage can go a little bit tricky, I guess. And then it continues, the scene. There are light-hearted hints at danger. Brahmins, this term is confusing because it's close to Brahman, the one meaning inherent unity, but Brahmin spelled this way also refers to the class of Hindus who are like the teachers. Originally, Brahmin is still used to indicate the sort of upper caste in India. And so the supposition is that people of the Brahmin caste are descendants of these teachers from the past. Anyways, it's sort of like the highest class, or caste is the correct term. So Brahmins who practiced austerities followed the procession, remaining aloof. So Brahmins, these are like religious leaders who practice austerities. Austerity is like when you deny yourself pleasures. So like when you wear hair shirts or you don't eat very much and you like pray a lot. Okay, so Brahmins who practiced austerities followed the procession, remaining aloof, afraid to walk amongst the elephants for fear of being jostled, and in the areas where there were women who might distract their inner vision. Some hopped along lightly on their toes in order not to trample on any live creature on the ground. This is kind of being lightheartedly making fun of Brahmins. There's a part of Hinduism that asks you to strive not to harm any living creatures. And so these guys are so devoted to their religion that they're like hopping around trying not to step on any like ants at all or something. Others held their fingers over their nostrils both to perform breath control, which is another part of Hinduism, and to keep their fingers from touching their nether portions while their minds were fixed on God. So I think the poet here is kind of making fun of these Brahmins here, that like they're trying to be good, holy men, practicing austerities, but maybe they are worried about being distracted from their inner vision by looking at women. They're trying to control their fingers to keep themselves from touching themselves in their nether portions, meaning like, below their belt kind of thing, while their mind should be fixed on God here. So anyway, this is kind of, I'm including these moments where like these hints at danger or hints of religious leaders kind of not really living up to what they should live up to as religious leaders. These kind of come towards the end of the section I had you read, and they might foreshadow some of the dangers that are awaiting Rama and Sita in the subsequent chapters. So feel free to keep reading, or please keep reading. We'll talk more about the Ramayana next time.